This is Dr. Subhangi from the Department of Food Science. So today the topic of discussion is going to be post-harvest losses and its impact on India's food security. Talking about food security and post-harvest losses, these are interconnected topics and very important in the global scenario. India's food basket comprises of a number of cereals like rice, wheat, millet, sorghum, barley, and all these are important energy providing foods. These form an important part of the diet, and India's production of cereals is quite high at 3.36 million tons as per the FAO data 2023. However, India in the global scenario also fares really well in terms of India is the largest producer of millets. It is the second largest producer of rice and wheat and the fifth largest producer of maize in terms of the production, and it incurs about $1.5 trillion annually. So this is a big loss in comparison to the post-harvest losses. India's global hunger index is very low and is severe at 27.3, and it ranks 105th among 127 countries, and hence there is a need to look into the post-harvest losses and where India is lacking. Even the malnutrition rates of India for women and children show alarming figures. Moving on to the next slide. What are the post-harvest losses in cereals, or what is the basic definition when we talk about post-harvest losses? Post-harvest losses are basically degradation of a food product or a commodity, both in terms of quality as well as quantity. By the time the food reaches the consumers, there has been a lot of losses in terms of quantity and quality. Now coming to the basic definition of qualitative losses, these are basically altered physical conditions or alteration in the perceived standards and deterioration in terms of texture, flavor and the nutritional values. Coming to the quantitative losses basically has to deal with the weight losses in the food and also losses which make the food physically unfit for the consumer. This is a basic representation of the post-harvest losses both in the quantitative and the qualitative aspect. Be it any cereals like rice, wheat or barley, they undergo quantitative and qualitative losses during the process. Quantitative, as we already know, is basically weight loss. Qualitative basically talks about the standards of the food, which makes the food unsuitable for any kind of a processing and gives us a lower yield. In terms of quantity, this is something which has to be discarded because it cannot go into the processing units because of the degraded quality. This next slide is basically the implications of the post-harvest losses for the cereal grains. When you are talking about implications, there are two basic implications. The initial one is the post-harvest loss, which basically happens in qualitative and quantitative terms, and it leads to economic losses both for the farmer and for the government as such. The second one is the larger scenario where we are talking about the food security parameters. Now food security parameters is basically the absorption of food, the accessibility to food and the availability of food. So when there are food losses or post-harvest losses in food, all these parameters get affected. A person might not get as much of grains as required, the cost might be inflated in the process, or it is not safe to consume. In terms of food utilization, if we provide a degraded product or a product which is not as good in quality, it affects the consumer's nutritional absorption also. Hence, the food has to be appropriate, nutritionally sound when it is provided to the consumer. So all these aspects of food security are also affected in case there are post-harvest losses. So food security depends on regular, sufficient and sustainable supply of food, which might be affected in case the post-harvest losses are not taken care of or they are not attended to right from the time the food leaves the farmer's field and reaches the processing units. The basic drawbacks of the post-harvest losses in cereal grains. First, we go into the basic causes. The causes might be poor infrastructure, logistics, this is dependent on the transportation area, lack of technology and knowledge, insufficient skilled labor, poor managerial ability and lack of markets. So these are the basic causes which might lead to post-harvest losses. And coming to the effect obviously the first impact is going to be the overall accessibility, availability and the utilization of the food, that is in terms of food security. It can be the farmers who are missing out on the income they are going to generate from this food because they have lost a few grains in the whole process. Increased price, that is the inflation, food inflation which affects the overall consumers and the country as such, and there are health issues in terms of malnutrition which is high specifically in children and women, and also the food poisoning. In case the food is contaminated in the process, it might be harmful for the consumers. Moving on to the next, the various stages. We know what post-harvest losses are, what are the different types in terms of quality and quantity, and now we should know which are the different stages the post-harvest losses can happen. So basically starting from at the two extreme ends, you can see it is the producer's basket, that is the farmer, and it is the consumer, that is people like us who buy the food. So during this process of the food getting transferred from the producer to the consumer, there are different stages the food has to cross through. So initial, the basic thing in the field there might be toxins, there might be soil quality, or there might be different microorganisms which are present which might affect the food quality. Moving on, harvesting. Now if the food is not harvested at a certain point, the food might be unfit and it might not lend itself to good processing. Moving on to transportation, again the major cause in which if the transportation is not appropriate, there might be spillage or there might be moisture absorption and the food might be unfit for any kind of consumption. Again moving on to storage. Now storage is one important aspect which needs to be taken care of. In case there is storage, there might be moisture migration, there might be attacks by insects and rodents which make the food unfit for any consumption. Coming to processing, processing is a number of processes which can be taken up for cereals like dehulling, threshing, winnowing methods, or even the milling processes. Now if the milling is not appropriate, the yield is less. When the yield is less, whatever reaches the consumer also gets affected or it is decreased. And moving on to packaging and marketing, so as the food from the processing units reaches the consumer, it might not be adequate. The same amount of food what we got from the farmer might not reach the consumer because there have been losses throughout this whole different stages starting from the field to the processing. Hence there are losses which might affect the food system as such. So the different types of post-harvest losses based on the stages. Till now we were talking about the different post-harvest losses which happen in terms of quality, quantity and the economic aspects. So here I have just tried to list down the basic causes and what are the different stages at which these causes basically take place. So if you talk about the field, there is shattering, there is lodging of the grains and there is delayed harvest, which again leads to post-harvest losses. Threshing, again incomplete threshing and scattering of the grains, again in terms of quantity of loss, that means there is loss of grains during this process. Drying can be both quantity wise as well as quality. If there is over drying, the grains are not fit for processing. If there is quantity loss because of drying also, that leads to reduction in the quantity of the grains. Similarly, handling and transportation again leads to spillage or moisture absorption, moisture migration in the grains, because of which the grains are infested by microbes. And you are talking about storage and processing, again different aspects wherein the grains can lose on quality, quantity, and overall all these aspects lead to an economic loss, which again is a loss for the farmers as well as for the government bodies. So this is basically a depiction of the post-harvest or the types of post-harvest losses which happen in terms of the grain being infested with insects, discolored grains, damaged grains, spillage. So the consumer does not get the benefit of the whole yield that the farmer is actually sending across to the consumers. And the picture here is basically talking about the percentage of post-harvest losses which have been given by agencies like ICAR and NABCONS in 2022. So the percentage of loss stands at 3.89 to 5.92, which is really high in comparison to the production that we are doing at this point. This is basically a representation of the whole scenario wherein the world population is increasing, production is happening, but the whole produce does not get translated as food for the consumer. So there is a need for increasing the yield, at the same time decreasing the losses, and these losses basically refer to the post-harvest losses which might happen because of insects, which can happen because of transportation methods undertaken, which can happen because of storage. So there is a need to have new emerging technologies and bring them into the field so that the farmer in the process is benefited, and we are also relieved of all these losses which happen throughout the whole farming system. The basic mitigation strategies, now if you talk about a farmer and how we can help the farmer to reduce the post-harvest losses, a few mitigation strategies include technical guidelines for the farmers, fostering usage of combined harvesters and mechanical dryers so that we increase the shelf life of the food, talking about warehouses where the food can be stored and the post-harvest losses can be reduced in the process, then talking about the storage spaces at the grassroots level where the farmer can harvest the produce and immediately put it into the storage houses and the quality of the product remains intact. These are basically the comprehensive management strategies to try and prevent post-harvest losses. These are being practiced at the government level or at the large scale level. So here we are talking in terms of the hermetic storage bags. We are talking about awareness sessions by experts to the farmers in the field itself. And then you are talking about storage infrastructure in the form of steel silos which is present, and these help in protecting the grain from any kind of attacks. And you are also talking about mechanical dryers right in the field where the grains can be dried immediately after the harvest is over. As we have already mentioned before, technological advances are required to bring down or to reduce the post-harvest losses. So here we are talking about the track and trace system. Basically uses blockchain and cloud-based technologies. This is to provide real-time data and to provide some kind of a transparency. So you can trace the grain. So it is basically dealing with grain traceability, where you can trace the grain coming from the farmer's point, moving on to the transportation units, then to the processing units, and then coming to the consumers as such. So the whole process is presented to the consumer, so you exactly know what are the processes the grains has gone through before it has come to you. So you can track the grains here. Then you have cold handling and storage practices. So grains would require, there are basically refrigerated aeration systems now which are coming into picture, and these would be required especially during the summers, where you have to maintain the temperature below 18 degrees Celsius so that the grains are aerated properly. So that whole aeration system passes into the bulk grains and you are able to dry it optimally and aerate the grains so that they are not moisture logged. Next one is the value chain management. That is again the whole system where you use AI technologies, where you use IoT, and here you are able to track the grains coming from the field to the consumers. You are talking about the novel intelligent packaging. Hermetic bags are one of the packaging technologies which is generally used for cereals. Along with it, newer technologies like intelligent packaging is also available. So this is basically to do with a lot of sensory packaging or active packaging, or even the use of biodegradable material for the packaging of the grains. So when you have indicators which suggest to you about the optimum temperature, about the drying levels, about the freshness of the grains, all these are ways by which you also have control over the post-harvest losses. And transportation, yes, transportation is a major thing. Now transportation is being taken care of so that we avoid spillage, we avoid any kind of rodent attack, so that the grains reach the processing units on time and they are not spoiled in the whole process, or there is not much delay happening. And finally, the grain drying technologies, these basically are talking about optimal drying of the grains, because any moisture is going to hamper the processing quality, is going to reduce the yield. So if you have a proper drying system in place, this definitely is helpful for the grain and its processing, and obviously the final yield which we get from the particular grain. IoT, one of the promising solutions to address the challenge of post-harvest losses. This is a system which is being used in all walks of our life, but now talking specifically about agriculture and the reduction of post-harvest losses, we are able to track the grain, we are able to help in the transport, we are able to forecast, and we are also able to help in the processing. So this is definitely something which is useful for the farmers, for the manufacturers, as well as the consumers. Now talking about transport, IoT also helps in the proper and the efficient transport of the grains on a timely basis and in the right manner. We are talking about smart food factories which are essentially using IoT as a means of improving the yield and also enhancing the product quality so that it reaches the consumer and the whole consumer is benefited in the process. At the same time, they also make use of byproducts from that particular grain, so there is not much of wastage and the whole grain is utilized for the product development. Finally, the last slide where we are talking about addressing or the importance of post-harvest losses. Now this is very important in terms of basic food security for the whole nation and for the people. Then you are talking about economic sustainability, environmental conservation. It's also a step to move India forward to achieving the Sustainable Goal 12, which talks of sustainable consumption and production patterns. Thank you so much.